Hello and welcome to another edition of Zog Science. Today we're going to be discussing evolution, kind of the history behind the kind of exploration of evolution and some of the basic principles of the theory. So, what is evolution? Evolution is the change in the genetic makeup of populations over time. And we're going to later on talk about what that means in a little bit more specific context. But for now, basically just kind of understand that what we're talking about is we're talking about the genes, right, and the alleles in a population, how they're changing over time. The amount that they show up over time is changing. All living things change, right? So all living things are evolving all the time. The human population right now is evolving. Bacteria populations living on and in your body are evolving. It's not an individual that evolves. Individuals cannot change their genes over time, right? Whichever genes you get from your parents at the beginning, when you were first fertilized, right? That's what you have at this point as well. Only populations as a whole can evolve. The mechanism for how evolution occurs is a theory, and it's a well-tested and supported theory called natural selection. So, one of the first guys to come up with some ideas as to how evolution occurs was a guy named Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, and he was the first one to propose how organisms change in 1809. And his was the theory of acquired traits. So what he basically was saying is that through time, a generation would use an organ more than the previous generation. So, for example, if we're looking here at these giraffes, right, the giraffes are using their necks more to try to reach trees, and then they would pass that trait on to their offspring. So he had a couple of assumptions. Number one was that organisms have a desire to change. So they basically have a kind of instinct, something that they're born with, where they want to better themselves for their environment. So based on wherever they live, their specific habitat, they want to get better in order to be able to live there. For example, birds tried to fly, and they were eventually able to grow wings because they were trying to fly. Another assumption of his was that organisms can change shape by using or not using their body. So he was kind of going off of the assumption that, if you've got a bodybuilder, right, or somebody who lifts lots of weights or something like that, that their body shape changes, right? You grow muscle. So he was kind of taking that idea and putting it forward a little bit, extrapolating it out and putting it into a different context. So kind of like the wings of a bird that does not fly would get smaller because they're not being used. Birds that flew more, maybe they would get bigger. Organisms can pass on acquired traits to their offspring. So basically, acquired traits are traits that you would pick up during your lifetime. So for example, if an animal developed muscles from running during lifetime, it could pass those muscles onto its offspring, or it could at least pass on a mechanism that would allow the muscles to grow larger during the organism's lifetime than the parents would have. So why was he wrong? Well, Lamarck, first of all, he didn't know about the inheritance of traits through the passing of genes. It was just they didn't know at this time what was the specific way that traits were inherited. Right, Mendel's work hadn't come out yet. All of the discoveries about DNA, remember, those were not until the early 1900s, mid 1900s. Okay. Also, acquired traits cannot be inherited. This is mostly true. However, there are some kind of traits that can be inherited. We kind of briefly talked about epigenetics a little bit, or we at least mentioned the word epigenetics in our DNA unit. And where this comes in is that you can actually have structural changes in chromosomes in your DNA that are a result of your environment where you live. And those structural changes to the DNA can be passed on to your children. And that's what's called epigenetics. Now, epigenetics is kind of a weird term, and it encompasses a lot of different things. But that's kind of the classic example of what epigenetics is. So then we've got this next guy, Charles Darwin, which I'm sure most of you have heard of. He was an English naturalist, and he traveled around the world on the HMS Beagle, and famously he was also in the Galapagos Islands. While he was traveling around the world, he observed many species and fossils, and through that work he devised his theory of evolution. This kind of shows his trip. So he came down here, went around the Cape of South Africa, stopped on the Galapagos, went around the Pacific Ocean, hit up Australia, New Zealand, came back around the Horn of Africa, and back home. So some of the species that he looked at was the finches. This was in the Galapagos. Here are a lot of the different finches that you find in the Galapagos. You can see they have a wide variety of shapes and kind of sizes, as well as beak patterns. There were also some tortoises that he looked at, some different tortoises. Again, these were all in the Galapagos. And then the blue-footed boobies, which is a type of bird. You can notice that they have really cool Carolina blue feet. And these are the Galapagos Islands right here. You can see that there are lots of them, and each one kind of has its own little micro environment, a little bit different from the rest. So Charles Darwin was influenced by the work of others. It wasn't just him coming up with a theory on his own, as with any scientific theory that's come up with. It's always a collaboration, or not necessarily collaboration, but building upon the work of others. So the first person that kind of influenced him was Thomas Malthus, and he had basically an idea that human populations would grow faster than the space and food supplies needed to sustain it. And so basically the only thing that was holding in check the population were war, famine, and disease. So how did that influence Darwin's theory? Well, basically, what Malthus observed about humans, Darwin saw in animal populations as well. And so what he saw was that organisms produce many offspring, but most of them die off. So in the wild, right, where we don't, organisms don't have a large supply of food and medical care and that kind of thing, most organisms have lots of offspring, and then most of them are going to die off, leaving only a few to survive. So Darwin kind of wondered what determines which individuals survive and reproduce. Which are the ones that actually make it, and why is it that they do that? So then Hutton and Lyell, these are kind of a couple of geologists. And Hutton, he basically kind of observed layers of rock in England. And so he was one of the first people to really propose that the Earth was millions of years old, or much older than people believed it was at the time. And Lyell proposed that geological features could be built up or torn down over long periods of time. So essentially things like the Grand Canyon was not just a static structure, but actually something that was constantly changing over time. Mountains were being built up and broken down over time. So after reading Lyell's book, Darwin was convinced that the Earth was old, and Darwin reasoned that if geological phenomena could change the Earth, then life on Earth could change as well. So if the Earth was being, the mountains were being built and eroded down, then organisms could change over time as well. And finally, farmers. So farmers have been doing their own kind of selection process, right? So when within a population there are natural variations, right? If you look around, your classroom or whatnot, you're going to see different variations, okay? And farmers, they improve their plants and animals through a process called selective breeding. So what they do is that farmers breed the plants or animals with the most desired traits. So for example, with fruits, they're going to take whichever plants produce the largest and the largest fruits, or the ones with the most flavor. You're going to take those plants and crossbreed them, selective breed them, so that way those traits are held onto. Okay, and humans do this with all of our crops. We choose the ones that we want the best, or specific traits, in order to create whatever product that we want. And this is called artificial selection. Dogs have gone through artificial selection. They're not technically different species, but we do have different breeds of dogs. And again, this is all because of selective breeding, right? So we started off with wolves, and then we slowly domesticated them over time. And then through the process of selective breeding, artificial selection, we have bred them for specific traits, specific purposes over time. So survival of the fittest, right? This is a term that a lot of people have heard about. So fitness is the ability of an organism to survive and reproduce in its environment. And the reason why it's important to include reproduction is because the whole point of evolution is that not only do you survive, but you also need to then pass on your genes to your offspring. Because if you don't pass on your genes to your offspring, then your traits die out with you. All right. So, for example, if we've got an animal that can easily avoid predators and is able to mate regularly, it has a higher fitness than an individual that does not mate. So deer that are faster, have better hearing, right? They're going to be able to avoid predators more easily. They would have what we would consider a higher fitness. They would be more adapted to survival. Individuals in nature with characteristics best suited to their environment survive the struggle for existence. So it depends upon the environment that you live in, which traits are going to be the best for you, right? Because if I don't necessarily want to be a white rabbit if I live in a forest, because my white fur is going to stand out. Okay, so your the characteristics or traits that you have are best suited for a particular environment. So natural selection. Okay, so artificial selection was where humans kind of choose which characteristics we want to breed. Natural selection is a process that occurs in nature on its own. So again, it's based upon the environment that you are in. It's based upon what other species live in the area, right? So you might have particular traits that help you elude a particular species, and so this is kind of where we get the term natural selection from, because it occurs naturally on its own without human interference. So let's take a look at an example at natural selection. There's a famous moth called the peppered moth that was found in England. There's kind of two different colorations. One is a whiter variation. One is a blacker, darker variation. And so that would be two variations of the same trait, which would be color. And prior to the Industrial Revolution, tree trunks were generally very light colored. So the Industrial Revolution occurred in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and this is where all of a sudden we start to burn a lot of coal and other and wood and other things, and what that does is it produces a lot of soot, and that soot is starting to cover trees. So before the Industrial Revolution, tree trunks are light colored. Therefore, predators were more likely to be able to pick out the dark moths. Right? Makes sense. We've got light colored trees. Dark moths are on the tree trunks. They're more easily seen. Predators can see that. More dark moths are eaten. Therefore, the moth population is lighter. Okay, it's primarily a lighter color. So you can kind of see that. This particular moth is going to be a little bit easier to hide against the tree trunk. These darker moths are going to be more easily picked out. After the Industrial Revolution, okay, trees are going to be covered in soot because, again, we've burned a lot of coal, oils, all these other things. The tree trunks are darker. What this means now is that predators are more likely to pick the light moths. Okay, so the lighter moths are easily standing out on the trees as compared to the dark ones. So the population shifts from a higher percentage of them being a lighter color to a higher percentage of them being a darker color. Right, so now our lighter moths are more easily picked out. Our darker moths are able to hide easier. So that's kind of a way that natural selection can occur. Obviously, that particular example was influenced by humans, but it wasn't something that we were choosing it specifically. It just kind of worked out that way. So just kind of a summary of Darwin's theory of evolution. Okay, individual organisms differ, and some of this variation is heritable. We can pass down that variation from generation to generation. Organisms produce more offspring than can survive. Okay, so if you look out in the wild or in nature, most organisms produce a lot more offspring than can actually survive based on the available resources. Therefore, okay, organisms have to compete for those resources. And only the most fit organisms survive and reproduce. So only those that are best able to find food, find shelter, find a mate are the ones who are going to survive and reproduce. And the most fit organisms only pass their traits on to their offspring, meaning that those genes, right, those alleles are kept in a population. The alleles that are not as fit or found on organisms that aren't able to reproduce are ones that are going to slowly disappear from a population. And species alive today are descended from ancestral species, right? So they've changed over time based on the environmental conditions. So what is a niche or niche? It really doesn't matter to me how you pronounce that. A niche is the full range of physical and biological conditions in which an organism, and also the way in which the organism uses those conditions. So how does a niche affect fitness? Okay, an organism's fitness is higher within its niche than outside its niche. Okay, so a penguin's fitness is higher in Antarctica than in Chapel Hill. Right? Think about why. We're going to discuss it in class. We've also got different niches for different beaks, right? So these are Darwin's finches that lived in the Galapagos Islands, right? So what we see is that some of the finches ate seeds, okay, and then based on what their diet was, which island they lived on, there was different food available for them. So over time, they changed, right? Their beak structure changed so that they could they were better adapted to eating whatever particular food source that they had, right? So the ones that were eating insects had to fly around and be able to snag the insects, so they're probably smaller, lighter, and faster. The ones that were using a tool, right, they need a fairly strong beak. Ones that are eating seeds need a very strong beak because they have to crack open the seed, so on and so forth. So adaptive radiation, this is just a particular one of the kind of types of evolution, is the process by which a single species evolves into different forms that live in different ways. So Darwin's finches are a great example of that. You had one finch species that came over to the Galapagos from mainland South America, and then it radiated, and when it went to the different islands, each island had its own food source, so therefore each of the finch kind of subpopulations adapted to that particular food source. We've also got you've got different types of adaptive radiation going on. These are some different fish. They all started off as a single species in a lake, but they evolved over time to eat different food sources. And here are some different finches as well from the Galapagos. You can see a little bit more clearly kind of the different bill structures. All right, that's all I've got for you today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.